Hello, and welcome to Media Assault, the podcast about movies, music, and video games. Visit us online at MediaAssault.com or on Twitter at Media Assault. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Media Assault, the podcast about movies, music, and video games. My name is Sean Kazat, and I am your host. I wanted to apologize for this week's episode being a little bit late. I usually record new episodes on Friday night so I can release them on Saturday. But this past Friday night, I actually had tickets to see Queensrÿche at the Hard Rock Live venue in Northfield, Ohio, which is essentially Cleveland. And I know that this week was supposed to be Games Week, but I kind of wanted to give a review of this show and talk about the band, and that really had me wondering if the format of the show is just a little bit constricting if I want to talk about something that's happened recently. So what I think I'm going to be doing from this point forward is whatever topic I want to talk about when I want to talk about it. And hopefully that will keep things fresh and interesting for you guys and for me. And to be quite honest, I was racking my brains for something gaming related to talk about this week, and I really just wanted to talk about this show and this band. So here we go. Now, I've been a big Queensrÿche fan since the early 1980s. In fact, the very first time I saw Kiss in 1984, Queensrÿche was the opening band. That was the Animalize tour. And I can't remember if I bought any of their stuff before I saw them live or if I started buying their albums after I saw them. But either way, it was right around that same time, December of 1984, that I got into Queensrÿche. And I thought The Warning was an amazing album. That was their 1984 release. And I thought their first release, the eponymously titled EP, was also very good. And I think that came out in 83. Everybody back then was talking about the amazing vocals of Jeff Tate, their lead singer. And at the time, he was being compared to people like Bruce Dickinson and Rob Halford, who were, metal royalty back then. All my metal-loving friends were saying, oh, Jeff Tate is the next best great lead singer. And it was about the time that I graduated high school in 86, July of 1986, that Rage for Order came out. And at the time it came out, I thought it was going to be my favorite album of all time forever. And even though I thought their image at the time, which was all glammed out, they were kind of wearing makeup and they had a lot of hairspray going on, I thought their look looked ridiculous. But the music I thought was unbelievably good. In fact, every time I hear Rage for Order, I am instantly transported back to my bedroom in my parents' house, listening with headphones on and reading the lyrics along with the songs. I remember listening to this album all the time. 1988, they came out with Operation Mindcrime, and that was a huge album for the band, and it managed to tap into my thoughts and feelings about the world at the time. It was very much a politically charged album, and it really took years for that album to fall out of rotation in my car's cassette player. And since that came out in 88, I've also bought the live releases of the album that the band has put out, like Operation Live Crime and Mindcrime at the Moor. In 1990, Empire, which featured Silent Lucidity, which was the band's biggest single, that album came out. And while I thought the album was good, I didn't like it as much as Operation Mindcrime. I did love Silent Lucidity. And I did go see the band for a second time at the Richfield Coliseum in Richfield, Ohio. Of all people, or of all bands, Suicidal Tendencies was the opening band. But overall, around that time, my enthusiasm for Queensrÿche started to wane, and they were just starting to achieve what amounted to mainstream success. The album sold 3 million copies, or over 3 million copies. But they were starting to move away from that sound that really got me into them in the first place. And their next album, which came out in 1994, was called Promised Land. Honestly, I didn't even buy it until it ended up in the cutout bin a few years later. I think 95 or 96 maybe I picked it up. And I thought it was okay, But my tastes had moved on, and the band had now incorporated a saxophone, of all things, into some of their songs. And to me, that was about as far away from what I thought of when I thought of Queensrÿche. The band was not real prolific back then. They released 2 more albums between 1994 and 2002, and I didn't bother with either of them. I think it was Here in the Now Frontier and Q2K. I didn't bother with either of those albums. But in 2003, I heard a song on the radio that sounded like Queensrÿche, and sure enough, when it was over, the DJ said it was called Open, and it was from a new album called Tribe. So I tracked down the CD at Circuit City, of all places. Remember Circuit City? And I bought it. And aside from that one song, I still thought that this was not the band I was looking for in terms of my taste at the time. Oddly enough, 2 years later, I saw the band play, opening up for Judas Priest on their Angel of Retribution tour. And they had a great set list, and my interest in the band was reignited very briefly. They played one new song, I'm American, and it sounded to me like a real return to form. I was like, okay, this is good stuff. They're finally getting back to what I think of when I think of Queensrÿche. And that song actually ended up on their next album, and it still remains one of my favorite song from that album. And that album was Operation Mindcrime 2, an actual sequel to Operation Mindcrime. And I went out and bought it on the name alone, and I actually reviewed it for Media Assault's website as a new release. And a quote from my review said, Operation Mindcrime 2 might not be the satisfying blast of intelligent, politically charged metal that I'd hoped it'd be, but it is a solid album from a band that's been in need of a shot in the arm for a while. And literally that was the last time I listened to that album in its entirety. Then the band released a covers album in 2007 and another album called American Soldier in 2009, and both of those I never even bothered with. I didn't hear one song from them. And in 2011, they released an album called Dedicated to Chaos, which I somehow got a copy of, but I know I didn't buy it. I don't know if somebody gave it to me or how I got it. But I only listened to it once, and it is honestly one of the worst albums I've ever heard. I think it's absolutely unlistenable. And it really made me wonder what had happened to the band that had been one of my favorites at one time. Were they that confused musically, or did they just not have any direction anymore? Now, I had no idea what was going on with the band, and apparently there was a lot of strife going on between some of the members and their lead singer, and things came to a head in 2012 when Jeff Tate was fired from the band. And I don't even want to get into what actually happened to cause that, because who besides the band members really know the whole story? But that situation resulted in there being 2 bands called Queensrÿche for a very brief period of time. One that featured original members Scott Rockenfield on drums, bassist Eddie Jackson, and guitarist Michael Wilton, and another one that featured Jeff Tate and a bunch of studio musicians. Tate's band put out an album called Frequency Unknown in April of 2013, and the remaining members, who'd been working with a vocalist called Todd LaTorre, put out an album called Queensrÿche in June of 2013. And there was quite a bit of news coverage about this situation, the fact that there's 2 bands called Queensrÿche, and I checked out both versions of the band. Tate's version sounded to me like it was a solo album. It didn't have that cohesiveness of a band album, and I found myself actually thinking it sounded like the band that had released Dedicated to Chaos. And what I didn't know at the time was a lot of the songwriters from Dedicated to Chaos actually were a part of Tate's band. His album, Frequency Unknown, wasn't nearly as bad as Dedicated to Chaos, but it still wasn't the Queensrÿche that I knew and loved. However, the band featuring the remaining original members sounded like the Queensrÿche that I liked back in the 80s and 90s. Todd LaTorre's vocals sounded like a shot of adrenaline to the band, everything sounded re-energized, and Latore was hitting notes that Tate hadn't hit in years. The songwriting was less eccentric and more rock-oriented. They weren't trying to be some cheesy opera. They weren't doing cabaret shows. This was the Queensrÿche that I'd been missing since 2003. So I bought Queensrÿche and I never listened to Frequency Unknown again. And in 2014, Tate lost the rights to the band name, and his version of the band became known as Operation Mindcrime. He also retained the ability to perform Operation Mindcrime, the album, in its entirety. And the original Queensrÿche retained the name and the Tri-Reich logo, that sort of bat-winged thing that you see on all of their merchandise and stuff. So in 2015, Queensrÿche released an album called Condition Human, which further solidified the band's classic sound while continuing to move the band forward with their new singer. And they've been touring intermittently for the album, and that's what they were supporting when they rolled into Cleveland last Friday night. To me, the fact that Jeff Tate was the original vocalist wasn't as important as the fact that the band was again making music that I enjoyed. Tate appeared to be the reason the band had veered off course in the first place. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter to me as much as the fact that I really enjoy Todd's singing and the songwriting that goes on in the band now. The past 2 albums have been listened to by me much more than anything the band has done since Empire. So in January of this year, when the band announced that they'd be stopping by for a show in May, I bought my ticket immediately. Prior to this show, the only appearance that I know they'd made in the Cleveland area was opening for the Scorpions in 2015, and I couldn't make it to that show. I wasn't going to miss them again. So on Friday night, the band came out. They didn't have an opening band or anything. The band came out with Best I Can, which is a track off of Empire, and immediately I knew I was in for a treat. I did notice that Scott Rockenfield was not behind the drums, and I later learned that he's been taking some time off to spend with his family. I guess he had a newborn son. So he's technically still in the band, but I believe the drumming duties are now being handled by a drummer named Casey Grillo, who played for a band called Camelot. He's no longer a member of that band. But Todd Latore's vocals live are just as strong as they are in the studio. And I did notice that he does use a bit of an echo or a delay effect to hold notes a bit longer, mostly as they trail off. But he was definitely singing live, and he's not using any kind of backing tracks. That's a claim that a lot of Jeff Tate fans make, that he doesn't really sing live. He's singing live. The band does use backing tracks, however, or at least an offstage keyboard or a trigger or something to play some sound effects cues from the Operation Mindcrime and Empire songs that are featured in the set. But so does Jeff Tate when his band plays them, so what's the big deal? So after Best I Can, they did Damaged, which is one of the more memorable and rocking tracks off of the Promised Land album. And I love the riffs on this track. Guitarists Michael Wilton and Parker Lundgren, he's been in the band since the Dedicated to Chaos days. Both of them sounded great, and they remained in fine form all night long. Next, the band turned to Rage for Order for The Whisper, and it was really apparent that Latore enjoys singing this one as much as the crowd loved hearing it. And actually, after the song was over, I heard someone behind me say, "That was worth the price of admission right there." And indeed, it was a powerful performance. Operation Mindcrime became the focal point for the next 3 songs. They played The Mission, Breaking the Silence, and I Don't Believe in Love. Specifically for the latter song, the crowd really got into singing with the band, which Latore made mention of between songs. And I was really encouraged by the turnout to the show, because I always am scared that older bands are going to end up playing to half-empty houses. But the crowd was definitely packed. It was an older crowd, but the place was definitely full. I didn't see any empty seats as I looked around. And the venue has a capacity of about 2,600 people. That's not bad. Latore then introduced the next song as the band's most popular, and of course, it was Silent Lucidity. The orchestral parts were backing tracks once again, but the rest of the song was played completely live, and it sounded great. And again, the crowd was in full throat singing the chorus. And I hadn't heard the band play this track live since 1991, and it was really good to hear it live again. And I will admit that I was really burned out on this track when it was on the radio all the time when it was popular, but hearing it performed live gave me a new appreciation of it. Next up, they played a song from their most recent album, Condition Human, and that song is Guardian. It's a fast-paced track that simultaneously sounds like classic Queensrÿche and currently relevant metal. Before the concert started, I was listening to people talk about their favorite Queensrÿche albums, and those that mentioned this album spoke very highly of it and really recommended it to those who said they hadn't heard it or bought it. And it is a killer album for sure. This track, Guardian, and Condition Human, which is the last track on the album, and the band did not play it on Friday night. Those are my two favorite songs from the album. Then they went from their newest album to their oldest, the eponymous EP, Queensrÿche from 1983, and they played The Lady in Black. And just as they had done with every song so far, they just ripped through it with confidence and power. And then they played the title track from Empire, and again, the crowd was singing along with the chorus in full support. And then they bounced back to the EP for another song to visit Queen of the Reich, and that's one of my favorite early songs and sort of the barometer I use to gauge the vocal power of Jeff Tate versus Todd Latore. Tate used to be able to belt this song out like a monster, but as time has gone on, it's disappeared from his set lists. And Tate has claimed in interviews that he thinks the song is adolescent and that crowds just stare blankly at the band when it's performed. Latore, on the other hand, just plowed through it with no hesitation, and the crowd was fist-pumping and singing along throughout the song. So I don't know what crowds Tate is referring to, but maybe it's possible those blank stares are a result of the way he sings it now, because he just doesn't have it vocally. The crowd that I was a part of loved every second of that song. Eddie Jackson stepped to the front of the stage and began playing the opening bass line to Jet City Woman. And that, of course, is from Empire. Jackson's kind of an enigma on stage. He doesn't smile at all. He seems fairly aloof through most of the set, but he still plays like a man who is really into the music. Toward the end of the show, especially after this song, he seemed to lighten up a bit and show some enthusiasm. I think I saw a hint of a smile on his face at one point, but I'm not 100% sure. But still, he was in fine form all night, and his playing was a highlight of this track. Then the band went back to the very first album of theirs that I heard, 1984's The Warning, and played Take Hold of the Flame. And that's a song that I find to be incredibly inspiring. It's one of their classics, it's one of their go-to songs, and that song pulled me out of I don't know how many depressed episodes when I was a confused teenager in the 1980s. But hearing it played at full blast, right in my face as a 50-year-old man, frankly was pretty awesome. And that song concluded the band's set, but of course they came out for an encore. There was a short drum solo, and then the full band returned to the stage and came out and played Walk in the Shadows from Rage for Order. And I hadn't thought about that song for a long time, and yet out of nowhere I was singing at the top of my voice when they played it. It's funny how those lyrics just come back to you when you hear a song that just clicks with you and transports you back, and you know all the words all of a sudden. Then they played another song from Rage for Order, which was Screaming in Digital, and that's the song. If you remember earlier in the show, I said that I thought that Rage for Order was going to be my all-time favorite album forever. That's the song that I thought that actually made me think that that album was going to be my favorite song till the day or my favorite album till the day I died. I love the drums, I love the lyrics, I love the guitars, I like the entire image that was being conjured up of this future that I was convinced was coming, where computers were going to be, controlling everything. I was a kid and I was heavily into computers at the time, and I just thought the song was a perfect blend of aggression and metal and computers and just everything I liked about the world at that time. Now, as an adult, I still think it's a great song, and the band delivered an incredibly powerful rendition, but I'm still waiting for that version of the future to roll around. The band closed with another song from Operation Mindcrime, Eyes of a Stranger, and while I would have preferred hearing Revolution Calling, you really can't miss with any song from Mindcrime. And as the song ended, Todd LaTorre thanked the crowd once again for showing up and singing along with the band, and then referred to the band as the one, the only Queensrÿche. And I couldn't agree more. Say what you will, Jeff Tate fans, I prefer this version of the band with this singer. A new album is promised by the end of the year, and I, for one, will be buying it. So that's it for this week's Media Assault. Next week, I will be talking about whatever I want to talk about with the new format of the show. I look forward to having you as a listener. Feel free to drop me an email at sean@media-assault.com. You can also reach me at Twitter at Media Assault, which is one word. Media Assault is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and Stitcher, and is hosted on Buzzsprout. Thanks again for listening. Take it easy.